Our next speaker is Patricia O'Donnell, founding partner of Heritage Landscapes, a woman-owned landscape architecture and planning practice. Patricia and her team at Heritage Landscapes were hired to create the Cultural Landscape Report for planting fields. Her presentation is titled Olmsted Brothers and Co-Planting Fields, Shaping and Recapturing Landscape Architecture Genius.
Thank you. Great to be back at Planting Fields. Yeah, there we go, first frame. So I think there's really an interesting evolution here, and I would say change is paired with continuity, because you can always read the landscape prior time and where it is, how it evolved. So I don't think the only constant is change. I think we have a lot of continuity, and when architects tell me the landscape keeps moving because it grows, I'm like, wait a minute. We have soil, we have views, we have built elements, we have the geology, we have the shape of the ground, we have all of these, what we call contributing or character-defining features. And within that framework, we have the hand of humanity. So I have kind of two parts to this presentation, but let me start by crediting this sketch, which is James Frederick Dawson, to the best of my knowledge, and it's a sketch of Coe Hall that is not what you saw John show last night and not what Whithold showed, but it's actually a relationship between land and building. And it's very clear in this sketch. So where is Planting Fields? So I've got this maybe too light of a yellow defining boundary line on the property here, but you see Long Island Sound off there on the upper right. This presentation is going to be really about Coe and the Olmsted brothers, and I've chosen several aspects of Olmsted design that I've seen in more than one place, but that is clearly articulated here at Planting Fields. So I'm grateful to John for the context and grateful to Whithold for the history, because I'm not giving you a history lecture. I'm actually going to talk about the design of this place and where we are today, where the CLR put us, and what the challenges are these days, which are pretty steep. So what we have here is the 1955 plan, because that is actually the end of the historic period of significance, because the original owner's hands are on the land until that date. So when we developed the CLR, there were a series of period plans, and the earlier work on this had been done by a colleague in Parks who had studied it for quite a long time. And Christopher Flagg was the director of the historic parks in New York, and he had had a real interest in Planting Fields. This was one of the historic parks that he was responsible for as he climbed the ladder at New York State Parks. And he'd gotten a pretty good level of historic research done. He'd had a colleague help him build some kind of skeletal period plans, but he couldn't get over the analytic and the where do we go from here. So a cultural landscape report has history, existing, an analysis of the relationships between history and existing, then what are the possible treatments, meaning what are the initiatives, where do we go in the future, what do we preserve, what have we lost that we might want to think about putting back, and how do we adapt to contemporary needs. So those last few segments were missing, and then we were asked to fill in the history, develop the analytics to a greater degree, build a better existing plan, and there were a lot of resources. So there was a 2017 GIS survey of multiple thousands of plants in the Arboretum, for example, that helped us with the mapping. So you see hundreds and hundreds of trees here. And you've gotten kind of the overview of dates, so we won't focus much on that. But the core area is this zone. And it's interesting because it's kind of the way the Hudson River houses are with two fronts, the riverfront and the land front. This has two entry points, a double entry organization. And the entry road with the beach LA, now removed as of this year. The diseased and the very few remaining original beach are now gone, making room for a new planting of white and chinkapin oaks. And the Carshalton Gates entry sequence over Hillendale through the woodland on your left. So I want to talk about design ideas, and I think these can be easily understood from some examples. At Prospect Park, the Longmeadow, Olmsted, and Vaux really worked on the idea of spatial extension and views. And this is very well understood that the Longmeadow is one of the penultimate examples of spatial extension and views. So when you look at this plan, there are a couple of things you can say. Okay, it's big, it's long, almost a mile. The circulation is to the edges. So you are at the edge, you are in a dappled light, and you see out to the side depending on which way you're going, but it's always to your left, either out or back. So you have a perception of this space as larger than it actually is because of the way it's been shaped. Here is a 1925 aerial. This is 6 years into serious work by James Frederick Dawson, and you see the plantings that begin to shape the east and west lawns. So as Whithold said, the lawns really didn't previously have any design layer on them. One of the things I would say was Coe's really interested in plants. And my take is that he hired Sargent, not necessarily Lowell, and I would say Lowell because the first time I saw him, the Fricks said his name was Lowell, and the first plants I saw of Guy Lowell were 1903 plants for Frick Park in Pittsburgh. Robeson Sargent had a really strong plant background. Coe was a plant collector. I believe Frederick James Dawson was the next one because Dawson had a very deep plant knowledge, and he was also connected with the Arboretum and had a history of knowing that place. So I think there's a slightly different hierarchy here than what Whithold just spoke to. So here is not a great black and white drawing, but it shows you the relationship of islands and edges on the top. And then below, it shows you the beginning of shaping those islands. So it's plan number 98. If you want to find it on Flickr, you can study it in detail. And it shows that the lawn margins are where they're working. So they're creating this relationship, open space to closed space. And the closed space is also for further exploration. So it's not just, green edge wall. So this is our 2019 plan with the orange line of the best knowledge we could get, combined sources. We always use a minimum of 2 documentary sources to verify something because you can have a plan that never got built. So you got to see a photo, you got to see an aerial, you got to have a minimum of 2 sources to understand what got built. So here, this orange edge shows you what's happening at the margin of the lawn and how it relates to the entry LA. And the house is essentially facing north. So this is extension to east and west. So if you had a grand house that had a really big space in both directions, it would really feel like a big space. So notice the edge. I think maybe the easiest way to talk about it is it's like the head of a cauliflower. It's this articulated, bumpy thing that's going on. So what does that do in terms of depth perception in a person? Well, when you have something in the foreground, something in the midground, and something in the background, you have a greater sense of space and spatial progression. If that were wide open and you had a foreground element and the horizon just blended away from you, if that was even a bigger space, it wouldn't feel as big as a space with this kind of edge definition. And this happens, of course, in Central Park and many other Olmsted landscapes, but this is a really good example of this articulated edge. So, for example, if you look to the right of Coe Hall and you see that stronger bump on the glass screens, the pointers don't work. What it does is it squeezes the space for a minute. And then you have the beech copse beyond it. And then there's enough distance between the beech copse and the back edge that there's a different quality of light behind it. So this is all about that progression that is fully intended and shaped. There's the beech copse highlighted in 1956 and 2019, just before it was taken down due to a series of disease and pests that are attacking the beach, which have now intensified. I heard a prediction a couple of weeks ago that the beach would be gone from the United States in 10 years. So here's a different scale of the same idea, the Vista Walk. So the plan on the left is the blueprint of the Olmsted Brothers Dawson plan, and the Vista Walk is the straight line, and the Azalea Walk is, I've highlighted parts of the Azalea Walk in orange so that you see what's happening here. And when you look at Maddie Edwards-Hewitt photo on the right from 21, you see that the density of overstory, understory trees and shrub mass is such that you cannot see to that nearby path. So the idea of that walk is that if you go down one way and you come back the other way, you get a whole sense of experience that relates to that circuit, and you don't feel like you're, because one of the rules in the naturalistic landscape of Olmstedian style, drawn from French picturesque and English picturesque, is that you never go back the same way. And everything you do, you're moving through the landscape. So this is at a different scale, that same notion of spatial extension in parallel paths that are invisible to each other. Drawing on something closer to James Frederick Dawson's era, Oldfields at Olmsted Brothers, Percival Gallagher was the principal in charge. We worked there for about a decade. The grading is really subtly and strongly representative of landscape. So if you look at this upper left view, you don't see any road. You see a little at the edge. And if you look at the view from like a drone height, you can see the road. This is the long axis that I've highlighted in orange here. And there are two roads that pass it, but when you stand at the house, you don't see those roads. So what's happening, I have died. Let's see. Third try. Can we get some tech assist to forward the slide, please? I'm pushing the right button. Oldfields is in Indianapolis. It's the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It's one of the 5 National Historic Landmark Olmsted landscapes, which I helped get that NHL designation. Great. So what we're looking at here is this, something's happened there because I think I lost some grading slides. Let's see. No, we're way off base here. Let me check, see where we're at. Grading. Yeah, so Karschalten Gates is an excellent example of this technique. So on the upper right, I've given you a detail of the grading. So those of you who can read a grading plan can see that. But what's happening is the road is crowned. At the edge of the road, there is a grassy swale. And then the land rises, and the rising land is above the grade of the top of the crown. So that's the way you get the road or the path to sit in the landscape and have the green of the landscape be what you see and experience. So at the Karschalten Gates, you'll also see on the lower left, I'm sure the folks at FLONS are cheering because FLONHS says, look, we save all these sections. That's what this is on the orange grid paper. And no one ever looks at them. And I'm like, no, no, no. I look at them all the time. You got to understand what the section is showing you. So you understand from this section the extreme topography they're crossing with this road. And what they're doing, and part of their genius, is to fit that into the grade and make it work. And additionally, they do their best, you know, given the starting point, given the ending point, given the intervening topography, to make that fit within the American Disabilities Act or ABBAG or ADA, whichever way you want to say it, gradients. So this is closer to 8% than paths that are 5% and under, but the rules now are the accessibility is under 5% to have no handrails and to have free passage, inclusive passage for all people of all abilities. So note on this second frame on the right that the tall piers of the Karschalten Gates are aligned to the beach row. There are additional beaches that have been set inside that more recently, like within the past 25 or 30 years. But that alignment is important too because it creates the breadth of space that you want to see as you move along the road with it set into the grade and with the green and then the trees lifting in the view. So another example of grading is the genius of setting the heather garden. This is a panorama by Hewitt in 27. And you don't even get a sense that there's a garden. What you see a little bit to the right of center is a couple of paving stones. This is the rebuilt heather garden that was inaugurated on Olmsted's birthday. And I'm standing on the high ground looking into the hollow, taking this photo. And here's the relationship it has to Coe Hall. So you see the topography lines descending on the west lawn, going downhill. So part of the way downhill, there's this entry into this other space that is really quite sequestered. And they're finding that hollow, shaping it further, and building a heather garden. So they're really creating two things here, using the hollow, shaping it for separation, and creating a space that is of a completely different scale than the east and west lawns. And suiting Coe's interest in plants, because he is like a plant lover. He gets not truckloads, not small orders, train car loads of rhododendron. So focus and dominance and the relationship in support. We have had the responsibility and the great good fortune to work for a dozen years at the Capitol. And this early view of the Capitol shows us the West Terraces. The West Terraces are Olmsted's team. They are not the architects. Olmsted walks onto the ground in 1874. The wings have been added, and this building is sitting with raw, rough grade down to Avenue A on both sides and no landscape. So what does Olmsted do? Over a period of years, this is maybe one of his most enduring projects. He finishes it in 1891, and he's the guy in charge, right? He's got teams, and then he's doing not only the design, but the construction administration, the way we would call it these days. So the terraces create a plinth for this massive building, and then the west lawn creates the largest possible green space, dropping to the west, topography toward the National Mall, which didn't exist at that time in the form we have it today. This is the 1894 plan, so that we have axial relationships coming down Maryland and Pennsylvania, and we have the relationship of how much lawn sits at the bottom of those terraces. So that's about dominance. The building is the most important thing. He even writes that, but the landscape has to fully support it. So what happens at the entry drive? This is one of my favorite planting fields drawings because it's a scribble, and we all have these. This is hand annotated notes of what is happening at that time behind the beach LA. So Coe's got the beach LA in 1918, just really kind of a few months before the Olmsted brothers take over. So the beach LA is a given. The planting behind it is variable. They're making a series of notes, what comes out, what should go in, how it should be handled. And this is a portion of the 1955, I think, aerial on the right. So we did a little annotation of this and put it over the contemporary plan to look at what this planting was all about. So what do we have? We have redbuds, dogwoods, crabapples, hawthorn, one other, arrayed along the back. If you think about the sequence of bloom of the flowering trees in the spring, to put all that together with the hawthorns perhaps being the last bloomer, you're going to have this peeking through bloom behind the beech trees all the way along. And then on the ground plane, mountain laurel and other elements. So this is Olmsted firm genius of how to do support to a feature that already exists. And then this is interesting because they work in arcs. This is a curved path, and the dominant thing is the movement between the pavilion and the sunken garden. But they have this edge relationship where I've put the horizontal orange arrow that goes into the surprise pool. So it's depressed, it's a little round pool, so it's again a scale shift. So it's like you could walk into the surprise pool by yourself, you could walk into the surprise pool with one friend and have a lovely conversation or a little romantic tryst, but it's not the same as the movement down the path to the formal Italian garden. And the CLR looked at and recognized multiple values of this place. And we did two guiding principles. The first principle was to preserve, restore, and steward the private ownership periods of planting fields, designed historic landscape for overall character within the context of current and future needs, including presentation and learning. And we purposefully use the word learning these days because education means there's an educator and there's uneducated. Learning means we're all learning together. So we've stricken the word education from most of our planning documents because we're all very interested in co-learning, and everybody in any group, there are people who have something to bring to the group. And the second principle is to steward the valued post-co collections and landscapes for presentation and learning, managing compatibly into the future. So the compatibility is really an important aspect here. The other thing with recognizing multiple values is aligning to the global issues. So globally, unbelievable as it may be, in the dysfunctional world of today, in 2015, nearly all the countries on the planet got together and agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. These are amazing goals, very encompassing. So even in our scoping of the CLR, we said, look, there are some Sustainable Development Goals that you can use and link local to global, and understand how you sit and what roles you can fulfill. So we use Goal 3, health and well-being, Goal 11, which is safe, sustainable cities, Goal 13, climate action, Goal 15, life on land, and Goal 17, partnerships. And these are the goals. If you haven't seen this or you don't have it, you should pin it to your wall. It's amazing that the countries of the world agreed, and we're halfway through the implementation. So we all need to do this. And if you look up UNESCO, SDGs, or the 2030 Agenda, you'll find all these graphics. So the issue also is embracing the entangled, inseparable nature of culture and nature. And with that kind of intro, I will just indicate that we've got some pretty complex contemporary issues these days. We have the whole notion of planetary rights, that's justice for all life. I mean, we're very focused on humanity, overly so. That's kind of why we are where we are in a planetary way. If we consider humanity but not as the dominator, we're talking planetary rights for all life forms. We have to reposition humanity as interdependent with our planet. We're looking at inclusion, welcome, and diversity from a nature lens and a culture lens. We have climate emergency responses. Those of you who don't know, there is a practice called drawdown, which is how do we get to net zero carbon? The whole notion of environmental services and ecology, the aspects that we can do toward habitat enrichment, the issues of resilience and adaptation, and certainly increasingly recognizing diasporas, because as climate change continues, the World Bank projects some gigantic number of millions of people that will be displaced. So I've been working on a model for a while which combines cultural diversity and biodiversity. And just to quickly run you through that, we have those two sides. We have natural habitats and human-shaped habitats. On the natural diversity side and on the cultural diversity side, we have tangible and intangible heritage. And when you put these together, they are not as symmetrical as the prior slides showed, because the UNESCO Convention on Biodiversity 2 years ago bannered their meeting with 75% of the planet deeply altered by humanity. So we're looking at more human-shaped habitats, either all the way from toxic brownfields to beautiful Olmsted landscapes, and the natural habitat of the planet shrinking. So where does this position Olmsted landscapes? It positions them as pretty important in biological diversity. So we can't just talk about them as historical objects. And then from the tangible side, we're looking at the remnants of the past and the material culture. And the intangible side, we're looking at traditions and practices. So in the bringing the CLR to the ground, we looked at 5 vectors: restoring the historic design, expanding and managing collections, presenting and uplifting ecology and scenery, enhancing the visitor experience, learning and services, and then pursuing the service functions. I mean, what do the people who manage this place need to do every day? In any plan, we have to think about the human resources on the ground and their skill sets and the budgets they have to move forward with their daily work. So, an image here of integrating the former productive field habitat for birds and pollinators. Because there's a lot of land out there, and a lot of it is not very strong in habitat, but there is huge potential for that habitat. And then interestingly, if you look at the woodlands on this property, the woodlands to the west is big enough to have interior woodland habitat. So those of you who have worked with ecologists know that the woods have to be 100 meters deep to have an interior. So all the way around 100 meters, that's 300 feet, you can have an interior of the woods, and that interior of the woods provides habitat for interior woodland species that are different than woodland edge and field species. So that brings us to some projects to undertake, and we suggested in the CLR that the Heather Garden was discrete and low-hanging fruit, and it's done. So the next project was to really address this notion of the beach decline along the main road. So if you look on the left, you're in the 1950s. If you look on the right, this is where we started. So there were, I believe, maybe 7 original beach of the 200 plus beach that were there historically. Maybe it was 180. So these are a couple of simulations we did in the office looking at the entry to the synoptic garden, the way it existed prior to the beach takedown, and then what the young trees would look like, having brought the road back to its narrow alignment, because that widening of the road at the synoptic breaks the interior movement flow. And I'm sure you were a little off-put when you came in and you had the bumpers and you had the little tiny building, and that's not the way the entry drive is supposed to flow. So that's part of a spatial sequence and the whole arrival experience. So this is the oak renewal planting 2023. It's about 95 or 6 oaks. The original beach spacing was very tight, which actually aided in the decline. Because it's a widespread tree, the roots graft, the disease vectors move all the way along it. So we're spacing these trees more widely. We're using 2 oaks, the white and the chinkapin. Why? Anything that anybody in ecology is saying is oak is the keystone. You're supposed to, by the end of the season, have your oak leaves look like Swiss cheese because so many insects ate them and so many birds were fed by those insects. And the white oak species as a group are doing better than the red oaks, which have several important disease vectors that are pressing on them right now. So this was a group build consensus decision, and what do you use? And I believe it was 2 weeks ago that the 110 oak trees were tagged for planting next spring. This is what will happen over time with the chinkapin in its growth. And we did this chart for the board about carbon, rainwater, and energy, how much stormwater is absorbed, how much carbon is sequestered, how much energy is conserved by the shade, plus air quality and many other benefits that trees have. And you can just vector the benefits across time. We all need to plant a lot of trees. And this is another simulation of what the drive looked like going toward the Camellia House and what it will look like 45 years hence with those oak trees grown up. So with that, I would just like to say we're shaping and recapturing some really landscape architecture genius here, and that we're interested in planetary rights. Thank you. Any Q&A? Any? Go ahead, Arlene. You got a mic here. No, I know you have an outdoor voice. I get it.
Anyway, the chinkapin oak, I'm not familiar with it. And are its characteristics like the white oak?
It's in the white oak family.
It's in the white oak family. But the white oaks, I mean, we know they're long-lived. The Waverly oaks were there for 700 years before they declined in Waverly, Massachusetts.
Yes.
But they have low branches. They're a wide-spreading, really sturdy tree. What do you do with low branches along a drive?
Well, the trees are already pruned at 7 feet because those are the rules for street trees now, and then they can continue to be pruned up while their heads grow. We got a left and a right here. We got another mic run.
Quick question, in terms of your planting the trees, are you going to plant the trees further back from the road to allow for their expansion? And are you going to remove the existing beech trees that are there that may not be diseased, but you suspect may disappear?
All the beech trees are gone, and they were all sick.
Okay. And the second question was, are you going to plant further back from the road?
They're 15 feet off. They're a little further than the beech, but there's also a better distance in between, and this is a V-shaped relationships, so the heads of the trees have more space to grow. So we've spread them this way, we've given more room in the interior, and we've set them in the same V shapes that the original were set. So the issue with an LA is it's a formal feature. So if you get the formal feature and you move down the road and you have the rhythmic of the trees and you have the size of the trees, then you have the feature. So the distance is really about health and well-being of the trees for the long term and planning for that health and well-being, recognizing all the pressures on trees. Additionally, we've got, I believe, 16 extra trees that will be planted around the property, 8 of each type, and in close proximity, so that if we need to replace a tree, we can spade that tree out off of a paved surface, not destroying other landscape to get it, and then put it in where that tree has declined. So we're trying to do all of this with long-term thinking. Not yet. No, it's not on. Yeah. Thanks, Charles.
You mentioned your involvement in the NHL for the Lilly estate.
Right.
I'm wondering from your depth of knowledge now, with the whole landscape report behind you, if you think that planting field is a potential NHL landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think the authenticity here is really quite good. You can track the evolution of this landscape and understand it. It has a lot of opportunity to enhance its character over time, and I think we've pressed those buttons in the cultural landscape report. I mean, changing a productive field to a meadow has similarities. if you're mowing it, 3-inch grass, it's very different than if it's a pollinator meadow and grass heads and seeds for the birds. So I think that it does have opportunity. When we looked at the tentative list for the United States, I was the co-chair of the final report on that for U.S. Sycamores. There were 5 nationally recognized Olmsteds right now. So the only ones that have the potential to go to the tentative list for World Heritage are those that are nationally recognized already. And those are Central Park, Shelburne Farms, Old Fields, Riverside, and Biltmore, if I've got them right. I think I do. I helped with Riverside, Biltmore, and Shelburne Farms. Riverside, Old Fields, and Shelburne Farms. So if Planting Fields' aspirations are toward NHL, from the landscape architecture side, the CLR has the documentation needed. John.
Could you tell me the distinction between changing and shaping?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking about the designer of the Olmsted Brothers, J.F. Dawson, and the team at Olmsted Brothers as engaged with a client to shape the land in a particular way by design. Change, I would define more as evolution over time due to all of the vagaries of whatever that time and those events bring forward. So I would depart those quite strongly, that the design moves of the shaping of a landscape are very different from incremental change over time. Lori.
Hi, this is Lori. Part of the answer to John is change includes entropy and shaping is not. Randomness and chaotic behavior. Decline, let's say, that's unaddressed. But I just wanted to compliment you on showing grading and cross-sections and to talk about form and space. Thank you.
Well, landscape architecture is kind of an inside club, and we all understand grading and shaping of space and how these things work, and we can analyze that. But I think for this audience and for this particular symposium, talking about Olmsted design characteristics was an important piece of work. It's actually kind of a new presentation for me, and I think it was exciting for me to put it together, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much to our morning presenters. We are now going to break for lunch. Lunch is in the writing room. There are boxes, so if you'd like to pack up your lunch and take it out on the grounds, please feel free to do so. There are also tables in the cloister garden. We are offering some tours of our Olmsted designed gardens, the Italian garden, the main drive, and the Heather garden. Please ask any Planting Field staff and they can help point you over there if you don't know where those are located. There's also a map in your tote bag that you should have received on your way in. There's also some information on NAOP and the National Park Service, as well as some books that you might like to look at out in the gallery. Please start making your way back around 1:30, and presentations will resume at 1:45. Thank you.